Hi everyone, I'm William Moore, and you are watching Beyond Belief. I pray that everyone's having a great day today, and I want to thank each and every one of you for tuning in to this, the fifth program on the new channel. Now, before we continue our discussion in Matthew chapter 24, I have a couple housekeeping items to touch on. The first thing is, in the last episode, which was part 4A, this being part 4B, I had to cut part 4 into two parts because I've got a lot of material to cover. So anyway, in part 4A, I was reading from my notes something that I meant to read in part 4B and probably created some confusion. Now, what I stated was, if you were watching part 4B right now, go back and watch part 4A. Well, that was part 4A, and people were probably like, wait a minute, we are watching part 4A. What's he talking about? Because part 4B wasn't even out yet. So anyway, I just want to apologize for that. That was a faux pas. And like I said, I blame it on the allergies. I'm still suffering from the allergies. So there might be a sneeze, there might be a cough, a clearing of the throat, a sipping of tea, or a sipping of water. So please bear with me. Also, prophecy matters. And why does prophecy matter? As stated before, almost 1/3 of Scripture is prophecy. So if you're in error concerning 1/3 of Scripture, and complete error concerning that 1/3 of Scripture, most likely you're going to be in error concerning a lot of other things within Scripture. Now, the thing we have to understand is, when the prophets were speaking in Tanakh, whether that's Yeshayahu, Isaiah, Jeremiah, or let's just say Daniel, Hosea, Zechariah, any of them, when they're speaking of prophecy, when they're making prophecy, it's concerning the advent or appearance of Messiah on the scene. It has to do with the messianic age. Now, when Yeshua is speaking, or Yochanan the Immerser, John the Baptist, or Yochanan the Revelator, John the Revelator, when they're speaking about their time period also, and the advent or revealing of the kingdom of Messiah. Okay, why would we think that those prophets in Tanakh are Yeshua or Yochanan the Revelator are speaking about something that's going to take place thousands of years within their future, when the main point of Scripture, when Scripture and prophecy revolve around the revealing of Messiah and his kingdom? Every prophetic text within Scripture has to do with the revealing of Messiah. It doesn't have anything to do with things in your future, my future, or even 2,000 and 3,000 years into their future. It has to do with Messiah and his kingdom. And this error takes place when people don't know the history which is associated with Scripture. Now, we need to know the history which is associated with Scripture. We're going to be in error concerning a lot of things. Everything pointed towards Messiah and his kingdom. He is the body. He is the substance. A lot of people today are still cleaving to the shadow. And a lot of the doctrines they believe in are doctrines which pertain to the shadow and exalt the shadow instead of exalting Messiah. So we need to realize that prophecy does matter. It has major implications for a way, it has major implications concerning people in the Messianic movement, Hebrew roots, Torah observant, Pentecostals, charismatics, anyone who believes in the futuristic doctrine. You're going to find that if you believe in the futuristic doctrine, you're in error. And what we've been doing is we've been going almost verse by verse through Matthew chapter 24 and proving with history, alongside of Scripture, that these things all took place within the first century, 70 CE. Okay, so we need to wrap our head around that, and we need to be familiar with history as well as Scripture, or we're going to miss everything. We're going to be in error about everything. Prophecy matters. It has major implications for our belief and what we believe. You know, I log into social media and I'll see these memes. I was talking to my wife about this earlier. I'll see these memes, people with pictures of Trump saying, greatest president in America's history. And now I'm not a statist. The whole presidential thing to me is, you know, I don't care who the CEO of the Corporation of the United States of America is. I'm not into voting. It's not my kingdom. I'm not into any of this whatsoever. I don't consider the president to be any type of authority. And but I do know United States history, okay? So therefore, when they make an erroneous claim like that, and I know the history of America, I know that Trump wasn't the greatest president in the history of the United States. There's people like Andrew Jackson who killed the bank, Thomas Jefferson who in a way killed the bank at his time. So I know that these people do not know their history. And when I hear people make futuristic claims about prophecy in Scripture, I know that they don't know their history either. Now, it might not be their fault. They've been brainwashed by the church. I was there. I believe in futurism. Then I graduated to historicism, which is futurism 2.0. And then when I realized things weren't making sense and I couldn't get the puzzle pieces to fit together, I said, okay, I need to stop. I need to empty myself of all bias, and I need to come at this afresh. And when I did, I discovered the truth. Because when I was reading the prophetic text, I also kept in mind the audience, the timestamps, and the history surrounding the first century. Now, one thing that we have to get straight is that all of these prophets were talking about the time, whether they're prophecies within Tanakh, in Torah, whether they're the prophecies in the Messianic writings. These prophecies all centered around the advent of Messiah. Now, why would prophecy ignore the most important time period in Earth's history? Why would it ignore that and be concentrating on something years down the road? All prophecy had to do and pointed to the advent of Messiah, his kingdom. That is what the timetable is about. Everything points to Messiah. And when we're talking about, things going to happen into our future, when we're putting ourselves in the first row, like Messiah's talking to us or Yochanan's talking to us, we're taking the attention away from Messiah. Because Messiah wasn't talking to us. Lots of times we're putting ourselves on the stage, not even in the front row, but on the stage. We need to allow the audience, which was intended to hear this, to be in the front row, and we need to be a spectator. As stated, prophecy is for us, but it was not written to us. So, you have in the book of Revelation, as I stated, when no matter what we believe about the book of Revelation, we must realize that it was written to that first century audience. Okay? It had to do with the persecutions they were going through. It would have been cruel for Yochanan to address those 7 assemblies and to ignore the persecutions and trials and tribulation they were going through and be speaking of a time thousands of years later. Timestamps, audience, we need to always remember that when we're talking about prophecy, or we're not going to have the truth. We're going to be in error. We need to get ego out of the way. A lot of people won't accept this because of ego. Some people won't accept it because of fear, because it's new. Some people won't accept it because they're afraid to step out of the box, step out of their element. And some people just like like to stay in that church doctrine. So, but we do need to get ego out of the way, because if you can't see this, or if you deny this, then it's all about your ego. Or you're just too afraid to step out of your box that you've allowed the church to put you in and see the truth. What we're going to see is Yeshua used the same kind of language which was used in Tanakh. We must understand the use of symbolical language by the writers of Scripture and Yeshua, especially when the references were to prophetic events, and more especially to times of Eloheinu's judgments upon peoples and nations. It is language that uses words and ideas of grandeur, of fantastic proportions, of celestial significance. It is not language that signifies an absolutely literal, materialistic, or natural fulfillment, as can be discovered by anyone who honestly studies these things. For example, almost the same identical language was used by prophets of old when they described the coming judgments of Eloheinu upon certain areas of people. In order to understand many expressions within the eschatology of the Messianic writings, it is absolutely necessary to go back to the Tanakh and see how the same expressions were used there. In that way, one lets Scripture interpret itself. And that's what we've got to do. Scripture along with history, the history of that time period. Many people do not realize the history which took place, and they're not familiar with history, so therefore, when they read the prophetic text in Scripture, they think, well, these things haven't happened yet. It's because they're not familiar with history. One more sip here. For an example of the way the writers of the Tanakh used highly imaginative language. Okay, and this is actually the best example there is, and I use this all the time, but for an example of the way the writers of the Tanakh used highly imaginative language concerning the universe to describe events that happened, look especially at Psalm 18. The heading describes the psalm as words from Dawid, or King David, concerning Eloheinu's deliverance of him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Shaul, or King Saul. It says, "Then the earth shook and trembled. The foundations also of the hills moved, and were shaken because he was wroth. There went up a smoke out of his nostrils, and fire out of his mouth devoured. Coals were kindled by it. He bowed the heavens also, and came down." One version says he descended. "And darkness was under his feet. And he rode upon a cherub, and did fly. Yea, he did fly upon the wings of the wind. He made darkness his secret place. His pavilion round about him were dark waters and thick clouds of skies. At the brightness that was before him, his thick clouds passed, hailstones and coals of fire. Yahuwah also thundered in the heavens, and the highest gave his voice, hailstones and coals of fire." Psalm 18, verses 7 through 13. You can also look at 2 Samuel 22, 8 through 10. You'll see the exact same passage. It's Dawid writing again about his deliverance from the hand of all of his enemies. In the midst of all these celestial and terrestrial scenes described by Dawid, he said, "He came down." But students of Scripture should understand that this is the kind of language used by the writers when they are prescribing the wonderful works of Eloheinu, usually in reference to his judgments and in reference to his deliverances and great blessings to his people, our great barakah. We are not to take these verses literally in a naturalistic sense. Dawid's deliverance was, of course, not really accompanied by such convulsions of nature, by earthquake and fire and tempest, but his deliverance, or rather his manifold deliverance, gathered into one, as he thinks of them, appeared to him as marvelous proof of the divine power, as verily affected by the immediate presence and finger of Eloheinu, as if he had come down in visible form to accomplish them. That is from Milton Terry, Biblical Apocalyptics, page 25. Very good book. I recommend that highly. It's somewhat of a hard read. It's from the 1800s, but it's a good read. And I think that people need to look at this. It's probably one of the most Hebraic books there is out there. And if you want to understand Scripture from a Hebraic viewpoint, I highly recommend getting hold of that book. Yeshua used the same kind of language when he said, "They shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great majesty." Yeshua coming down and in the clouds of heaven with power and great majesty. What beautiful and powerful language describing the manifestation of Yeshua as the Son of Man in his kingdom. Now, this language was borrowed from the ancient hieroglyphics, for as in hieroglyphic writing, the sun, moon, stars were used to represent states, empires, kings, queens, and nobility, their eclipse and extinction, temporary disasters or overthrow, etc. So in like manner, the Kodesh prophets call kings and empires by the names of the heavenly luminaries. Their misfortunes and overthrow are represented by eclipses and extinction. Stars falling from the firmament are employed to denote the destruction of the nobility. Now that's from Warburton's Divine Legation, Volume 2, Book 4, Section 4. The fall of Babylon is represented by the stars and constellations of heaven withdrawing their light, and the sun and the moon being darkened. Behold, the day of Yahuwah comes, cruel and with wrath and fierce anger, to lay the land waste, and he shall destroy its sinners out of it. For the stars of the heavens and their constellations shall not give light. The sun shall be darkened in its going forth, and the moon shall not reflect its light. That's from Yeshayahu, Isaiah 13, 9 and 10. The destruction of Egypt by the heavens being covered, the sun enveloped with a cloud, and the moon withholding her light. And when I put you out, I will cover the heaven and make its stars dark. I will cover the sun with a cloud, and the moon shall not give her light. I will make all the bright lights of the heavens dark over you, and will set darkness on your land, says Yahuwah Eloheinu. And that's from Ezekiel 32, verses 7 and 8. The destruction of the Yehudim by Antiochus Epiphanes is represented by casting down some of the host of heaven and the stars to the ground. And out of one of them came forth a little horn which waxed exceeding great toward the south and toward the east and toward the pleasant land. And it waxed great even to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and of the stars to the ground, and stamped upon them. Yea, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host. And by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. That's Daniel 8, 9 through 11. And this very destruction of Yehrushalayim is represented by the prophet Yoel. And it shall come to pass afterward that I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your old men shall dream dreams, your young men shall see visions. And also upon the servants and upon the handmaids in those days will I pour out my spirit, and I will show wonders in the heavens and in the earth, blood and fire and pillars of smoke. The sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood, before the great and terrible day of Yahuwah. And it shall come to pass that whosoever shall call upon the name of Yahuwah shall be delivered. For in Mount Zion and in Yehrushalayim shall be deliverance, as Yahuwah has said, and in the remnant whom Yahuwah shall call. That's from Joel 2:28 through 32. Now, let's take a look at what Kepha has to say about the prophecy of Yoel. But Kepha, or Peter, standing up with the 11, lifted up his voice and said to them, Men, Yehudim, and all who dwell at Yehrushalayim, let this be known to you, and listen to my words, for these are not drunk as you suppose, for it is the third hour of the day. But this is that. Let's read that again. But this is that which was spoken by the prophet Yoel. And it shall be in the last days, says Eloheinu, I will pour out of my spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. And in those days I will pour out my spirit upon my slaves and my slave women, and they shall prophesy, and I will give wonders in the heaven above, and miracles on the earth below, blood and fire and vapor of smoke. The sun shall be turned into darkness, and the moon into blood, before that great and majestic day of Yahuwah. And it shall be that everyone who shall call upon the name of Yahuwah shall be saved. Acts 2:14-21. This is that which was spoken by the prophet Yoel. He says this, what you're seeing right now, right here and now, is what was spoken by the prophet Yoel. This is that. Not something in the future is that. Something 2,000 years from now is that. This is that. Again, let us take a look, for example, the case of the prophesied fall of Babylon to the Medes in 539 BCE, and how Eloheinu used this celestial and universal language to describe the judgment that would come on her. The burden of Babylon, which Yeshua, the son of Amos, saw. Behold, the day of Yahuwah comes, cruel and with wrath and fierce anger, to lay the land waste, and he shall destroy its sinners out of it. For the stars of the heavens and their constellations shall not give light, and the sun shall be darkened in its going forth, and the moon shall not reflect its light. And I will visit evil on the world, and their iniquity on the wicked. And I will cause the arrogance of the proud to cease, and will lay low the pride of tyrants. And that's from Yeshayahu, Isaiah, chapter 13, verses 9-11. So, Eloheinu is using celestial and universal language to describe the judgment that was going to come upon Babylon. Again, note the prophecy of Ezekiel against Egypt. And when I put you out, I will cover the heaven and make its stars dark. I will cover the sun with a cloud, and the moon shall not give her light. I will make all the bright lights of the heavens dark over you, and will set darkness on your land, says Yahuwah Eloheinu. Ezekiel 32:7-8. Also note in Amos, and it shall come to pass in that day, says Yahuwah Eloheinu, that I will cause the sun to go down at noon, and I will darken the earth in the clear day. This was in reference to the northern kingdom. So, would you say this language was talking about something that was literally done in a materialistic way? Or would you say the language is symbolic and represented in celestial language, something that would take place? Hopefully, people are smart enough to see the latter. Yeshayahu, chapter 34, is full of symbolic language depicting in principle the awful judgment of Eloheinu, which was to come and did come against the nations Udamiah and Bozrah in particular. Come near, nations, to hear, and you people listen. Let the earth hear and its fullness, the world and its offspring. For the anger of Yahuwah is on all nations, and his fury on all their armies. He has completely destroyed them. He has delivered them to the slaughter. Also their dead shall be thrown out, and their stink shall come up out of their dead bodies, and the mountains shall be melted with their blood. And all the host of the heavens shall be dissolved, and the heavens shall be rolled like a scroll, and all their hosts shall droop, as a leaf falls off from the vine, and as the falling from the fig tree. My sword bathed in the heavens. Behold, it shall come down on Edom. Excuse me. It shall come down on Edom, and on the people of my curse for judgment. The sword of Yahuwah is filled with blood. It is made fat with fatness, with the blood of lambs and goats, with the fat of the kidneys of rams. For Yahuwah has a sacrifice in Bozrah, and a great slaughter in the land of Edom. And the wild oxen shall come down with them, and the bulls with the bulls, and their land shall be soaked with blood, and their dust made fat with fatness. For it is the day of Yahuwah's vengeance, the year to repay for the fighting against Zion. And its streams shall be turned into pitch, and its dust to brimstone, and its land shall become burning pitch. It shall not be put out night or day, its smoke shall go up forever. From generation to generation it shall lie waste, none passes through it forever and ever. Or forever and forever. That's from Yeshayahu, Isaiah 34, 1 through 10. Now, it says that it shall not be put out night or day, its smoke shall go up forever. We know that the smoke is not going up right now. That is symbolic language, and forever does not mean forever, as we see in our Greek abstract mind when you are looking at the Hebraic text. Forever can mean just to the horizon, as far as you can see. Read verse 4 again. And all the host of the heavens shall be dissolved, and the heavens shall be rolled like a scroll, and their host shall droop, as a leaf falls off from the vine, and as the falling from the fig tree. This is identical language that is given in Revelation chapter 6, 13 and 14. And the stars of heaven fell to the earth, even as a fig tree casts her untimely figs when she is shaken by a mighty wind. And the heaven departed like a scroll when it is rolled together, and every mountain and island were moved out of their places. Revelation 6, 13 and 14. Some people believe that the preceding passage in Revelation refers to a time in our future, but it does not. It applies to the judgment and destruction of Israel years ago in fulfillment of Yeshua's prophecy. Note the next two verses. And the kingdoms of the earth, and the great men, and the rich, and the chief captains, and the mighty men, and every bondman, and every freeman hid themselves in the dens, and in the rocks of the mountains. And they said to the mountains and rocks, Fall on us, and hide us from the face of him sitting on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb. It is the exact language Yeshua used in Luke 23, 28 through 30. But turning to them, Yeshua said, Daughters of Yehrushalayim, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming in which they shall say, Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bore, and the breast which did not suckle. And they shall begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. This was language depicting the Great Tribulation in Israel in 67 through 70 CE. This kind of language is used, picturing the response of sinful man to the awful judgment of Eloheinu. Notice how Eloheinu uses the same language about Israel in Hosea 10 and 8. Also the high places of Avon, the sin of Israel, shall be destroyed. The thorn and the thistle shall come upon their altars, and they shall say to the mountains, Cover us, and to the hills, fall on us. Hosea 10 and 8. Back to Yeshayahu 34, where Eloheinu used such figurative language to describe his judgment against rebellious people. In verse 8 he said, For it is the day of Yahuwah's vengeance. This is not a future Armageddon, but was judgment of Idumeah and Bozrah. Notice the highly symbolic language of verses 9 and 10. And its streams shall be turned into pitch, and its dust to brimstone, and its land shall become burning pitch. It shall not be put out night or day. Its smoke shall go up forever. From generation to generation it shall lie waste. None passes through it forever and forever. Isaiah 34, 9 and 10. Read this last verse over carefully. It is symbolical and figurative language or not? Or does someone say it literally happened like that? With prophetic announcements, Yahuwah used symbolic celestial language to describe events taking place in the natural. So let's not take the words too naturally, because the Hebrews don't. The Hebrews, they're familiar with their own idioms, with the metaphoric language. They're familiar with the expansiveness of the text. They know how poetic it is. We're trying to look at this language, this Hebraic language, with Western eyes. And we need to cast away the Western lenses that we're using and use Hebraic lenses, or we're not going to understand the text. As you hear Eloheinu speaking in Yeshayahu concerning the celestial happenings at those local judgment scenes, note that Yeshua uses the same kind of language when talking about judgment upon Israel in his generation. Immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. This is highly symbolical language, the same style used by the prophets in the Tanakh to describe the shakeup of things at the judgment of Messiah in the destruction of the land of Israel and Yehrushalayim and the Hekal in 67 through 70 CE. The temple, the land, and Yehrushalayim all destroyed. This imagery is the same imagery used in the Tanakh and pictures the final dissolution and destruction of the Yehudim nation. It is a picturesque portrayal of the greatness and majesty of Eloheinu in times of judgment. Even the earth and the heavens seem to dissolve in his presence, as in Revelation 20 and 11, when earth and Shemayim, are the heavens, fled from the presence of him who sat on the great white throne. I do want to point out here, take time to pause, to read that's why I have all of this up on a presentation here, all of the text up on a presentation so you can follow along, so you can write down, take notes, write down what scripture passages I'm reading from, and go back to those, read them again, and look at some of the commentary along with it, to hopefully get a better grasp of what's being said here. So, going on here, Yeshua said, the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. The writer of the book of Hebrews tells us about this. Yet, once more, I shake not the earth only, but also heaven. And this word, yet once more, signifies the removing of those things that are shaken, as of things that are made, that those things which cannot be shaken may remain. Wherefore, we, receiving a kingdom which cannot be moved. Hebrews chapter 12, 26 through 28. Here is shown the removing of the old covenant and the reception of the new. The writers of Hebrew quotes from which says, yet once, it is a little while, and I will shake the heavens and the earth, the sea, and the dry land, and I will shake all nations, and the desire of all nations shall come, and I will fill this house with majesty, says Yahuwah of hosts. Haggai chapter 2, verses 6 and 7, talking about the removing of things made by man's hands, that first hekal, the physical hekal, which there were 3 of, but the physical hekal, the removing of that, and the establishing of something that cannot be shaken, that will remain, and that's the kingdom of Mashiach, the kingdom of Messiah. That's what that text is about. The writer of the book of Hebrews indicated that the fulfillment of that prophecy was in the process at the time the book of Hebrews was written, shortly before Yehrushalayim was destroyed. Eloheinu, who at many times and in many ways spoke in time past to the fathers by the prophets, has in these last days spoken to us by his Son, whom he has appointed heir of all things, by whom also he made the worlds. Hebrews chapter 1, 1 through 2. He says, has in these last days, the last days of what? The last days of the Hekal, or temple administration. We need to realize that when we put these things in the future and we put ourselves on the stage, that we're definitely taking away attention from Messiah, and that's who all prophecy revolves around. A kingdom which cannot be moved was received. The culmination of all this shaking took place at the ending of those days of tribulation. Immediately afterwards, it was then that Eloheinu brought forth his perfect world order, the Malkut, or age of Messiah, the kingdom of Messiah. That is the perfect world order, as Messiah stated in Matthew chapter 28. All power has been given to me in heaven and in earth. All power. And when we're trying to give Hasatan all the attention and saying that he has all power, we're making Yeshua Messiah out to be a liar. I'm not going to do that. And I don't like giving any attention, any praise to Hasatan like a lot of people try and do today. All power has been given unto me in heaven and in earth. Who said that? Yeshua said it. All power. Not some power. All power. We need to wrap our minds around that. It's rather easy to do. The stars falling from heaven, Matthew 24:29, represented the downfall of the entire Yehudim commonwealth as represented by the leaders. Princes and nobles of the Babylonian kingdom were called stars in Daniel 8 and 10, and were said to be cast down. Now the language can relate to Israel. And immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun shall be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from the heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. Matthew 24:29. Yehudim writers understood the light to mean the Torah, the moon, the Sanhedrin, and the stars, the rabbi. Yosef in a dream saw the sun and the moon and the 11 stars obeying him. Genesis 37 and 9. And there we see the same kind of typology used, as we know this referred to the brothers of Joseph finally having to yield to Joseph when he became ruler in Egypt. Yeshua said that the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. What would Yehudim people have understood these words to mean? Let's take a look at Yeshayahu. And I have put my words in your mouth, and have covered you in the shadow of my hand, that I may plant the heavens, and lay the foundations of the earth, and say unto Zion, you are my people. Isaiah 51:16. Planting Shemayim, or the heavens, and laying the foundations of the earth, was symbolic language for Zion's becoming Eloheinu's people. Eloheinu did not literally plant the heavens and lay the foundations of the earth at this late date of writing. It is symbolic language. Therefore, it is only logical that the shaking of the powers of the heavens and the passing away of Shemayim, the heavens, and earth afterward, would mean the utter end of Israel as a physical nation. Remember that Kepha, Peter, used similar language on the day of Shavuot when he quoted from Joel 2. And I will show wonders in the heaven above, and signs in the earth beneath, blood and fire and vapor of smoke. The sun shall be turned into darkness, and the moon into blood, before that great and notable day of Yahuwah comes. These events at Shavuot, or Pentecost, happened in the last days of the Hekal age, and in connection with the anticipation of the day of Yahuwah. This had nothing to do with any prediction of a futuristic day of Yahuwah or an Armageddon, but had everything in the world to do with that cataclysmic event at the coming of Messiah and judgment upon Israel in those days. This day of Yahuwah occurred with the judgment of Eloheinu upon Israel in 67 through 70 CE. The blood and fire and vapor of smoke remained as proof that Eloheinu had come on the scene and that Yeshua was at the right hand of Eloheinu in heaven, or Shemayim. Take your exhaustive concordance and look up the numerous times and expression day of Yahuwah. Okay, so in your concordance it will say day of the Lord. So take your exhaustive concordance and look up the numerous times the expression day of the Lord is used in the Tanakh. Notice here several in particular. Yeshayahu, Isaiah 13:6, against Babylon. Yeshayahu 34:8, against Idumea, Bozrah, and all nations. Ezekiel 32:3, against Egypt. Yoel against Israel, the heavens would tremble and the sun and moon be darkened and the stars withdraw their shining. Zephaniah 1-7 and 14 against Yehuda. Zechariah 14:1 against Yehrushalayim. So we see in these passages that the wrath of Eloheinu is displayed in judgment upon unbelieving and rebellious people. This is called the day of Yahuwah in Scripture. There were many such days of Yahuwah. Writing down a note here for myself. Yeshua plainly said in Luke 21:22 that these be the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. The events described by Luke were those connected with the destruction of Yehrushalayim in 70 CE, and notice that he said these were the days when all these things which were written were to be fulfilled. Not some other day, hundreds or thousands of years later. These tragic events were not, will be, the fulfillment of all the remaining prophecies concerning Israel. And if all things were fulfilled then, how could any of these prophecies relate to Israel in our future, okay? So, these tragic events were the fulfillment of all the remaining prophecies concerning Israel. Not will be, but were. And if all things were fulfilled then, how could any of these prophecies relate to Israel in our future? While I personally look on these things mentioned as apocalyptic language describing some great event as occurring, I do not mean to say that there were not actual and literal signs seen during those awful days. And there shall be signs in the sun and in the moon and in the stars, and upon the earth distress of nations with perplexity. The sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them for fear, and for looking after those things which are coming on the earth. For the powers of heaven shall be shaken. Luke 21:25-26. Luke stated there were to be celestial signs. F.W. Farr, drawing from Josephus, Tacitus, and the Talmud, summed up a few of those things when he said, in Yehrushalayim men told how, at the Passover of 65 CE, a mysterious light had gleamed for 3 hours at midnight in the set-apart place. How the enormous gates of brass, which required the exertions of 20 men to move, had opened of themselves and could not be closed. How at Pentecost the priest had heard sounds as of departing deities, who said to each other, let us depart thence. That's from Farr, page 416, and he's drawing from Josephus in the Talmud and other writings. In his book, The War of the Jews, Josephus said, while they did not attend nor give credit to the signs that were so evident and did so plainly foretell their future desolation, but, like men infatuated without either eyes to see or minds to consider, did not regard the denunciations that Eloheinu made to them. Thus there was a star resembling a sword, which stood over the city, and a comet that continued a whole year. Thus also before the Jews' rebellion and before those commotions which preceded the war, when the people were come in, great crowds to the feast of unleavened bread on the 8th day of the month, Nisan, and at the 9th hour of the night, so great a light shone round the altar and the Kodesh house that it appeared to be bright daytime, which light lasted for half an hour. This light seemed to be a good sign to the unskillful, but was so interpreted by the sacred scribes as to portend those things that followed immediately upon it. At the same festival also a heifer, as she was led by the high priest to be sacrificed, brought forth a lamb in the midst of the temple. Moreover, the eastern gate of the inner court of the temple, which was of brass and vastly heavy, had been with difficulty shut by 20 men, and rested upon a basis armed with iron, and had bolts fastened very deep into the firm floor, which was there made of one entire stone, was seen to be open of its own accord about the 6th hour of the night. Now those that kept watch in the temple came hereupon running to the captain of the temple, and told him of it, who then came up thither, and not without a great difficulty was able to shut the gate again. Then Josephus in his account goes on to say, but the men of learning understood it, and the security of their Kodesh house was dissolved of its own accord, and that the gate was open for the advantage of their enemies. So these publicly declared that this signal foreshadowed the desolation that was coming upon them. Besides these, a few days after that feast, on the 21st day of the month, Artemisius, a certain prodigious and incredible phenomenon appeared. I suppose the account of it would seem to be a fable, were it not related by those that saw it, and were not the events that followed it of so considerable a nature as to deserve such signals. For, before sunsetting, chariots and troops of soldiers in their armor were seen running about among the clouds, and surrounding of cities. Moreover, at that feast, which we call Shavuot, Pentecost, as the priests were going by night into the inner court of the Hekal, the temple, as their custom was to perform their sacred ministrations, they said that, in the first place, they felt a quaking and heard a great noise, and after that they heard a sound as of great multitude saying, let us remove hence. That's from the Works of Josephus, Volume 1, Book 6, Chapter 5, pages 453 and 454. Luke's parallel account says, and there shall be upon the earth distress of nations, with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them for fear, and for looking after those things which are coming on the earth. The roaring of the sea is reminiscent of Yeshayahu 17:12. In the prophecy, the sea often symbolizes chaos or stands for a source of fear. The Sea of Galilee represented an abyss, and to go to the other side brought fear upon people. Woe to the multitude of many, which make a noise like the noise of the seas, and to the rushing of nations that make a rushing like the rushing of mighty waters. The nations shall rush like the rushing of many waters. Isaiah 7:12 and 13. I don't like that one. It takes too long. At the closing of the tribulation of those days, and following the sun and the moon darkening, the stars falling, and the powers of the heavens being shaken, then it is that sign of the Son of Man in heaven appears. Then it is that the sign of the Son of Man in heaven appears. Sorry, I got reading too fast, which I do quite a bit. So I'm going to go back over that. At the closing of the tribulation of those days, and following the sun and the moon darkening, the stars falling, and the powers of the heavens being shaken, then it is that the sign of the Son of Man in heaven appears. The universe of the Yehudim collapses following the tribulation period, and then it is seen that the Son of Man is in heaven at the right hand of power. But in those days, after that tribulation, shows that immediately after means in those days that followed upon that tribulation, and Yeshua said that all things would be fulfilled in that generation, Matthew 24:34. That one's cute, I like that one. We have seen how Yeshua used language that his disciples would understand, the same kind of language used in the Tanakh when great and mighty events occurred. Mark and Luke both show that the question of the Talmudim disciples actually referred to only one event, or different events happening in the immediate proximity of each other. Notice, when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of your coming, and of the end of the world? And what sign will there be when these things shall come to pass? From Matthew 24:3 and Luke 21:7. Matthew puts the sign with his coming, and Luke puts the sign with these things, together indicating they are one and the same in their minds. See also Mark 13:4, where Mark says, "What shall be the sign when all these things shall be fulfilled?" If Matthew, Mark, and Luke record the same conversation, then it has to be admitted that Yeshua's answer referred to one and the same situation, and not two or three different events separated by many hundreds or thousands of years. Okay, so I want to point something out here. Now, in Mark 13:4, he says, "What shall be the sign when all these things shall be fulfilled?" Now, what's he talking about? When all these things? Well, Messiah was talking. He stated, "See here, all these things, I tell you that not one stone shall be left upon another." Now, that's also an idiom, because we do find stones from that time in Yehrushalayim upon another. It just means utter destruction. So anyway, just want to point that out, because I feel that's a very important point there. Moving on. It is unthinkable that the Talmudim, or disciples, had any other time factor in mind that when Yehrushalayim and the Hekal would be destroyed, and they did connect these events together in his answer. It is only thousands of years later, egotistical, misled men tried to make the chapter refer to different events that separated by a period of 100 years or even thousands of years. So, thousands of years later, we have egotistical, misled men, and they try to make the chapter refer to different events separated by a period of hundreds or even thousands of years. That is ignoring all of the timestamps within Scripture. That is ignoring the audience, placing yourself in the first row or even on the stage, instead of allowing the Talmudim, the disciples, to be in the first row, Yeshua to be on the stage, and you being a spectator of what is taking place. One may ask, if these things have already happened, why is the future tense used in speaking of them prophetically? So when Yeshua is speaking, of course, he's using a future tense. These things were future to those in that generation that saw them come to pass. But if they occurred before that generation over, then it stands, or if those things occurred before that generation was over, then it stands to reason that they would not be future to us, though they were to them. The same can be said for many of the things in the book of Revelation. So, I mean, really think about it. Let's read that again. If these things have already happened, why is the future tense used in speaking of them, prophetically? These things were future to those in that generation that saw them come to pass. But if they occurred before that generation was over, then it stands to reason that they would not be future to us, though they were to them. The same can be said for many of the things in the book of Revelation. So, when he's talking to them, and even when he says no man knows the day or the hour, no man knew the day or the hour at the time he spoke it, but they knew the day and the hour after it had come to pass in that generation. Okay, they were future to them, but past to us. He was making a prophetic statement then when he was on the Mount of Olives with them. He was making a futuristic prophetic statement then, but then 40 years later it came to pass, so now it's historical to us. It has been fulfilled. It has been clearly shown that the judgment upon Israel with all its horrible tribulation period is closely connected with and involved with the coming of the Son of Man and the manifestation of his kingdom. This is not to say that the destruction of Yehrushalayim itself was the parousia. This is only one of the things that happened in connection with that great event. The time factor is the same. All happened in that generation. The age finally came to a close with the destruction of its city and its temple. The entire government of the Yehudim, economy, rulership, priesthood, rituals, sacrifices, all became dark and fell from heaven. And the Son of Man was seen sitting at the right hand of Eloheinu and coming in the clouds of majesty. That's what this is all about. And I've clearly shown that the judgment upon Israel, or Yisrael, with all its horrible tribulation period, is closely connected with and involved the coming of the Son of Man and the manifestation of his kingdom. Okay? It all happened in that generation. The age came to a close with the destruction of the city. That city is no more. Okay? Now, also I want to point out one thing where Yeshua said that a rampart would be built around the city, a wall. That's not a way that we conduct warfare today. There would be no reason to build a wall around the modern day city of Yehrushalayim or even the old city there. And there's nothing in the old city except a bunch of shops. It's basically Disneyland for Christians or believers. But anyway, that's not the type of warfare we have today. You don't build the wall around the city and take a city, besiege a city that way. Excuse me. However, building a rampart around a city, that was a way that they conducted warfare back then. Today, you would just bomb the city or shoot missiles into the city. You wouldn't build a wall around it. So that is something when Yeshua was speaking about that building of a wall around a city, which did happen in 70 CE, and that happened back then. That was how they conducted warfare back then. The Romans built a wall around the city, besieged the city, didn't let anyone in or out. No supplies could get in. No one could get out. Anyone trying to get out would be killed. That's how warfare was conducted back then. It's not how warfare is conducted in the modern age. So that verse alone would not be applicable to today. It's applicable to back then. Just like all of this is applicable to back then. And the coming of the Messianic age. The Yehudim lost everything. The priesthood, the rituals, sacrifices, all fell from heaven, meaning not recognized by heaven anymore. And the Son of Man was seen in heaven, sitting at the right hand of Eloheinu, coming in the clouds of majesty, showing that it was now his kingdom. No longer belonged to the Levitical priesthood, which a lot of people in the Messianic movement still follow. But Hebrews chapter 7 says we have a new high priest from a different tribe, Yehuda, a tribe which no one gave attendance to at the altar. A priesthood after the order of Melchizedek. And what does it say? It says, for the priesthood being changed, so also came a necessity, a change of Torah, our law. In the next part of this series, we will look at the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, our Shemayim. I want to take this opportunity right now to thank you all for bearing with me. I know there were times that I had to cut out because I had to cough. I know that I committed some faux pas with pronunciation because, well, we're all adults here, of mucus in my throat building up. Probably should not have taken a Mucinex before doing this. But anyway, thank you. I'm sorry for some of the errors. I might do this one over in the future, as well as part 4A over in the future, because of the allergies and how the sinuses are affecting me. But thank you. I do apologize for any errors that I made in pronunciation, or where I was reading too fast and read over something and had to go back. It's just right now, with all of this going on, my throat is extremely itchy, as stated, mucus issues and watery eyes where I'm not seeing the screen clearly. So anyway, thank you for bearing with me. And next time, like I said, we're going to start really moving along quickly here. And actually things are going to get better and a little bit more exciting as we start to delve into the end of chapter 24. And we start to look at these things as how they need to be looked at. So anyway, for Beyond Belief, this is William Moore. Until next time, Shalom Ve Barakah, which means peace and blessings.